So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's great to see so many people here. For those of you who've been to our previous webinars, welcome back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. So this webinar series is on the role of language in sustainable development. And as we said, we're delighted to see so many of you here. So these webinars are run by our team of our project team. We're based in the University of Essex, the University of Botswana, University of Zambia, and Dar es Salaam. And our project is looking at the ideas of multilingual resources and sort of this notion of bringing the outside in. So we're part of a funded project exploring the ways in which language is used in and outside of school, and to what extent can the language practices that students and teachers might engage with outside of school, to what extent are those resources made use of in schools, and to what extent can the use of those languages help facilitate learning in classrooms. So these are some of the kind of the main areas of interest that are driving our project. And one of the things that we wanted to do during these webinars was to sort of bring similar projects together. So people collaborating in similar ways, looking at similar issues, particularly around sort of sustainable development goals and working in sort of South-North collaborations, and to see where we have synergies, where we have similarities, and to kind of, discuss our work in this kind of broader forum. So thanks again for joining us and for being part of that. We do have other webinars planned as part of this series, so you're welcome to come and join us for those too, and we'll put the information about those in the chat box as we go along. So today it's a real pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, who are Philip Harding-Esch and Hywel Coleman. So both Philip and Hywel have been involved in language and development for many years, particularly the conference series. And their talk today is titled Language and Sustainable Development Goals, which is also the title of their book in its 12th publication, or the 12th publication, sorry, to emerge from the Language and Sustainable Development Conference. So today we are really looking forward to hearing them talk a bit more about the projects that they've been working on and kind of, the things that they've been learning as a result of that. So without further ado, Philip and Hywel, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Philip Harding-Esch. I'm a consultant in languages and education based in the UK, and I was the lead editor of the book. And over to you, Hywel.
Hi, I'm Hywel Coleman, Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the School of Education at the University of Leeds, but living in Indonesia, just outside Jakarta. I've been involved with the Language and Development Conference series for quite a long time. I'm very happy to see Jeff Cruz from Sydney is here. Jeff was one of the founders of the conferences. Yeah, I think that's enough from me to start with.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, moment of truth. Let's see. Yes. Is that all good? Okay, so we're going to zip through this. There's quite a lot to cover, but we wanted to really show you the front cover of the book. Very long time coming for all of us involved. Really pleased it's finally been published. I'm going to start by just quickly going through what we hope to cover today. So we'll talk a little bit about the history and the development of the LDC series before moving on to look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the whole Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And I'm going to look at the book itself and some of the chapters and key messages in there before Hywel moves the discussion on to what's happened since a lot of these chapters were written, and hopefully we can have a good discussion after that about some of those questions. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Hywel, for the next slide.
Right, thanks. So the Language and Development Conference series has been going since 1993. The first conference took place in Bangkok, and they've taken place more or less regularly once every 2 years since then, except in 2007. In recent years, they've alternated between Asia and Africa. And it's very interesting to see what the focus of the conference has been over time, going back right to the beginning. There was mainly a concern with English in development projects, and things have changed a lot since then. The book that we'll be talking about today is each conference is led to a publication, and all of those publications are available on the conference website, which you can see there. And many of the publications have been published by the British Council, and they're also available on the British Council website, Teaching English. The one we're talking about today is the product, the outcome of the 2017 conference in Dakar. Since then, there's been another conference, and we understand that the proceedings from the 2019 conference will be published very soon, much more quickly than our book. Okay, next slide. So before we come to the Sustainable Development Goals, I thought we should mention briefly the preceding goals, the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in 2000 and had 2015 as their target point. They were relatively modest. There were eight goals, and the role of languages in working towards these goals was clear in most cases. And UNESCO published a very useful, interesting book called Why Language Matters for the Millennium Development Goals, which clarified, which drew out the relationship between language and the goals. I think everybody found that very useful. And the assumption was probably that the Sustainable Development Goals would give a similar role, or would recognize the importance of language in the same way. But I'll hand back to Philip now.
So yes, in 2015, the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals for 2015 to 2030, much more ambitious. There were 17 goals, which are listed there on the screen, based on the achievements of the MDGs, and described as a universal framework for sustainable development. But the big question is, for us, is where languages are mentioned, where do they feature in the SDGs? And the question is, and the answer is that they're not at all. So a language is not mentioned anywhere in the SDGs. There are 17 goals, 169 targets within those 17 goals, and in turn, 231 specific indicators which countries report to. And none of those are to do with language. There is one optional sub-indicator, as it's called, which measures the percentage of primary school students learning in their first language, but it's not one of the main ones. But it is still worth mentioning that the existence of that sub-indicator is still an achievement, and in fact, recognizing really that education is the one area really where language and development is gaining traction, and obviously noting that UNESCO has been advocating for mother tongue based education since the 1950s. So it's not nothing, but there's certainly a sense of disappointment about the lack of visibility for languages in the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is where the 12th Language and Development Conference itself comes in. So this was hosted by the British Council in Senegal. It was supported by a series of partners, including regional and international partners, including La Francophonie, which we think is quite significant. We think it's the first time that British Council and La Francophonie worked together in that way. The conference was run bilingually in French and English, and it didn't look at all 17 SDGs, but focused on 3 of them. It focused on SDG 4, quality education, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 16, peace, justice and strong institutions. And those 3 SDGs form the structure of the book itself, which has actually got 4 parts to it, because we've split the education chapters into policy, focus and practice focus. So we have 4 parts looking at education, economic growth, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. So what I'm going to do now is look through these 4 sections and talk about some of the chapters in groups and identify some of the interesting points and the key points that emerge from them. So the first part is SDG for quality education perspectives on policy, and bearing in mind that multilingual education is the main area where language policy has been developed. These 3 chapters at the beginning are really an excellent overview and critique of current policy and discourse in the field of multilingual education for development. They also challenge the so-called Northern Agenda and give examples of success from the Global South. So for example, Carol Benson gives an overview of what's working and what's not working so well, with a really good analysis of research, policy, practice as well, and evolutions in terminology. She reminds us as well usefully that there are concepts out there that do not exist in the Anglophone sphere, but which are out there nonetheless. Similarly, Barbara Trudell looks at, what she calls the paradox of a global curriculum that's being adopted around the world, but which actually leads to a diversity of outcomes on the ground because communities are adopting it in different ways. And Kathleen Hughes' chapter is an excellent reminder. She reclaims what she calls the centuries of scholarship and experience in the Global South when it comes to multilingualism, and reminds us that the North has a lot to learn from the South and not the other way around. And she explores different kinds of multilingualism within that. So those 3 together are a really good start to the book. The next 3 chapters in that section show 3 very different examples of bottom-up, locally driven initiatives which exemplify some of those issues. So for example, Mary Goretti Nakabugo is the country coordinator in Uganda for the citizen-led assessment program there, which is controversial at times because unlike a school-based assessment, it takes place in the home. It's done orally with volunteers. But she shows in her chapter that this generates robust data which really can hold governments to account. In a completely different context, Shannon Bischoff and Mary Incabo talk about complementary schools in the US, i.e. community-run initiatives focusing on mother tongue-based education and showing how those communities can claim the sustainable, the development agenda for themselves. And many of us here will be already familiar with the work of Frederica Lupka and her team, the Linima project in Casamance, Senegal, which is a language-independent literacy program for contexts where identifying a single mother tongue as the language of instruction is not really realistic because of the number of languages being spoken. The next part of the book covers some of those mother tongue issues. These are 3 chapters from research taking place in Senegal, where the language of instruction is normally French. But these 3 chapters look at bilingual models which have been implemented in Senegal, in which the languages of instruction are a local language in addition to French. French, of course, being a foreign language for most pupils. So Chris Darby and Jorun Dijkstra's chapter really does show that this change results in some marked improvements in literacy for children. But what's interesting is if you read Ndieme Sao's and Augustin Dion's chapters, they also have questions about some of the issues surrounding the choice of a single language, local language, above others. So they refer, for example, to parents who are worried that there's competition between languages or that their own systems of representation may disappear for their children. Finally, we have a couple of chapters from Caroline Juillard in Senegal and Anne Rossiter, who did work in Sierra Leone, where they really look at teachers and the role that they play and the choices that they're making in the classroom and the implications for policy there. Third part of the book looks at decent work and economic growth. And really the messages here are about diversification and inclusion and the role of languages in there. So in Chethi, for example, really looks at the importance of local language literacy for adults, because a lot of the work is concentrating on young learners and children. But he really shows the immediately transformative effect of language literacy for adults in the Global South and their communities. Boulanger and Salikoko Mufwene argue that economic and education policy together must encompass local languages and include the whole population, many of whom are excluded because their language is marginalized. Boulanger has some really interesting data looking at the link between health, the economy and education, data from the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And Salikoko Mufwene makes a really strong argument that the economy and education are intertwined and that they have to be expanded to include local values and break away from international ones. Finally, this final section of the book is on SDG 16, on peace, justice and strong institutions. So these are very diverse chapters, but an overarching theme here could be that local languages and populations sometimes struggle for space and recognition under internationally defined and post-colonial frameworks. So for example, Amat Hisana talks about the role of Kalam Arabic, which is a language spoken by millions of people in the Sahel and the Sahara, but is not really recognized internationally and is poorly understood by many. But the populations there are using that language to achieve social cohesion and democratic rights. I also recommend Jimmy Harmon's chapter, which is really interesting because it charts the status of the vernacular French-based Creole in two different neighboring islands, Réunion Island, which is part of France, and the Republic of Mauritius. And he compares that the way the language faces different struggles for recognition in these two different legal and educational frameworks. These two chapters are really interesting as well. They look at language and legal systems in Francophone West Africa. So Nathalie Tar and Alice Sambou looking at the practice of legal translation in courts in Burkina Faso and Senegal, and Mohamed Abdalali and his colleagues looking at the accessibility of legal language in Senegal for ordinary people. They really argue that colonial power structures are perpetuated through language in these systems, and that the systems therefore cannot really provide equal access to justice or democracy for ordinary people. The final set of chapters, there are two looking at the issue of refugees. Anne Wiseman looks at integrating Syrian refugees in Lebanese mainstream classrooms, and Chris Soughton looks at refugee camps and argues that the SDGs struggle sometimes in situations like this, where refugees are by definition not from the country they reside in. We have one chapter there by Alexis Lefranc about digital literacy. He looks at the issue that the real divide, as he sees it, is not really in access to technology, but skills in using it, and actually argues that if educationalists and development experts don't pay attention, they might be leapfrogged by tech entrepreneurs in this field. So looking at a few of the lessons learned emerging from the book overall, the obvious headlines are, given the invisibility of languages in the SDGs, that the SDGs should include specific references to language in the targets and indicators, and furthermore should evolve to give space, more space to local contexts and also accommodate different value systems. There's certainly an emerging thing about the predominance of the so-called Northern Agenda. Coming out quite strongly is that the best way to achieve the SDGs is to empower people themselves to do it. So that might include work on language itself, such as translation of the SDGs or codifying languages to turn them into agents for development, as well as prioritizing locally driven models with institutional support. And there's a strong point that policymakers need to work together with researchers and people on the ground to make SDGs happen, and that linguists in particular need to recruit other disciplines, especially in the field of economics. And finally, just as a general point, that languages are foundational to the three SDGs that this conference and book look at. Before I pass on to Hywel, just a few final thoughts about this. First of all, I feel that the book and the chapters really show us that languages are everywhere, whatever the SDGs say. We see in these chapters many examples of people, from policymakers to grassroots to individuals, making choices all the time based on language to do with their own lives. Also, there is really a story of progress and struggle within these chapters. So even though, bearing in mind, again, this was written before the pandemic, for example, these chapters are hopeful in that they show progress and arguments being made for language in development, including successful community-led initiatives and examples of influence on policy. But the struggle is definitely there all the time. So we see that especially in the inertia of institutions and power structures, the fragility of many of the local initiatives, and arguably in the nature of the SDGs themselves, which rely so heavily on narrowly defined sets of data. And the final point I wanted to make was that there are many examples in the book of people thinking outside the box. So where many of the chapters are talking about moving towards the SDG framework and maybe negotiating their way out of established or often post-colonial frameworks, there's also a recurring theme of lateral creative ideas for breaking out of the SDG framework altogether to accommodate more diverse realities. So I'm thinking, for example, of Lilima's language independent approach, or Bolangite and Salipoko Mufwene calling for multidisciplinary approaches to economics and recalibrating economies, or Abdullah Lee et al.'s multi-legal approach, to the monolith of the Senegalese legal system, or indeed Chris Soughton's call for pragmatism when it comes to refugee camp situations. So with those thoughts on what the role for languages in the sustainable development agenda is now, going forward, I'll pass on to Hywel for the next part.
Right, thanks, Philip. So what Philip has been talking about is based on the reports that were made at the conference in 2017. So in other words, talking about situations, projects, contexts relative to the period between maybe 2015, 2016, 2017. But the world has changed since then, as we all know. We're all very aware that there have been dramatic changes throughout the world since then, partly caused by COVID, and then partly we can think of Trumpery, the influence that Trump has had and has been followed by other national leaders. So I'd like to have a look at some of these changes and think about the impact that they're having on the Sustainable Development Goals, the extent to which the SDGs can be achieved, and then longer term on development goals in general. So I'd like to look at COVID and health, COVID and education, the whole issue of fake news, and then growing inequality within nations. I'm going to give some examples from Indonesia, and growing inequality between nations. No, next slide, please. Next slide.
Sorry.
Right. Thanks. So, an issue that has arisen in many parts of the world has been how to communicate health messages relevant to COVID. It's clear that in many, many contexts, people don't understand. They're not receiving information that they need in languages which are accessible. And this leads to all sorts of misunderstandings. For example, there's an interesting case from Mozambique, a small study of 140 young people carried out by VSO, which found that they believed that they could avoid the coronavirus by taking vitamin C, avoiding canned foods, avoiding alcohol, and avoiding noise pollution. This sort of thing is very widespread. There have been some attempts to communicate health advice in local languages. SIL in Indonesia has drawn up advice in 77 local languages. Indonesia has 700 languages. And the Indonesian government says that it's produced advice in 66 languages, though I haven't seen them. And here's one example from Australia, the Duwaya language, with advice about the importance of washing hands. And then it's not only in developing countries, apparently, where this is an issue. The headline at the bottom of the page is from the UK, where apparently the government has failed to communicate important messages to communities in certain cities in the Midlands, I think. Communities whose first language is not English. So this has been an issue from the appearance of COVID, and it's still there. And the consequence, of course, is that COVID is not being dealt with as efficiently as it could be. And people are suffering and people are dying, and language, the failure to communicate effectively is part of the problem. Okay, next slide. Right, the next issue is education. I think we're all aware of it, that education has been disrupted for children in many, if not most parts of the world. But the longer term implications are very serious, and I think perhaps there isn't much awareness of this yet. The issue of learning loss, people first became aware of it after the earthquake, very serious earthquake in the Pakistani part of Kashmir in 2005. The disruption to education lasted for 3 months, but then ongoing research has found that the impact of the disruption to education was not just 3 months, catching up on the 3 months, but it actually lasted for 12 months. So learning loss was 4 times the duration of the disruption itself. Moreover, the impact has continued since then as people have become adults and they're compared with their peers who were not affected by the disruption to education. It turns out that their nutrition is poorer and even that their stature is lower, they're shorter. And there is even an indication that lifetime income loss is significant as well. Similar research has been carried out in Thailand after flooding disrupted education for a couple of months, and very similar long-term consequences have been identified. And also in Argentina, where a teacher's strike lasted for 88 days some time ago and disrupted children's learning. Now, these three cases, 3 months after an earthquake, 4 months after a flood, 88 days of a strike, are relatively short periods. We're now talking about disruption which began in March last year and is still going on. Now, if the impact of a 3-month disruption is 12 months, how long will the impact of disruption for 15 months last? And we don't know how much longer it's going to go on. It's not, it's still going on. And this is for, it's estimated 1.5 billion children have been affected in this way. I think the implications of this are really very serious and have not been addressed yet. catching up is clearly not an option. I think there is, at least here in Indonesia, I have the impression that the government thinks that once children go back to school, they can pick up where they were in March last year, and a little bit of time will be needed to catch up. But it's not going to be like that. Children are going back. They're losing what they already had. So this is a really serious issue, I think. Next slide. Okay, the issue of fake news, I think we're all aware of this as well. There's nothing new here. Some examples, one from Indonesia, a common phenomenon is that when somebody dies of COVID, the hospital wants to deal with the corpse in the standard way for COVID corpses. Relatives don't understand this at all, and there have been frequent cases of families coming into the hospital and fighting to get the corpse of their relative, and sometimes they succeed, and then they deal with it in the way that they think is most appropriate according to Islamic teaching. And so again, we can see that there's a problem of understanding and not being willing to recognize that the hospital has information which they don't have, has an understanding that they don't have. There is a gap between the relative's perception and the hospital's perception. And then, as we know, lots and lots of stories about what causes COVID. I read something in social media yesterday, which said that Russian scientists have proved that COVID is caused by bacteria, not by a virus, and you can solve it very easily by taking aspirin, and the COVID scare is a Western conspiracy by governments and drug companies. And then, again, we find in many parts of the world reluctance to take vaccines. Vaccines contain pork, vaccines have killed thousands. Someone I know in London has tried to convince me that thousands of people have died after being vaccinated. So the gap between the people who need information and the people who own the information and are trying to help seems to be getting wider. It's not improving. The gap is not narrowing. Okay, next slide. Here's an example of growing inequality within nations. There are two faces of Indonesia in 2021. The picture on the left is an advertisement for a very well-known, very expensive private hospital in South Jakarta, Rumah Sakit Pondok Indah. Jeff may be aware of that, which offers video consultations with doctors. And it's clear that this is appealing to a target audience who are very familiar with using the internet, who are comfortable using it, and who would find it maybe rather impressive to consult their doctor by internet. Another advertisement from the same hospital shows an obviously very wealthy patient consulting her doctor while traveling in her chauffeur-driven car by phone. On the right-hand side, a very different picture of Indonesia is two girls in Luwu in Sulawesi in central Indonesia, climbing a tree, trying to get access to the internet. A major issue in trying to continue education by internet, by distance in Indonesia has been, firstly, families need to have a mobile phone. And so that means an expense. If there are several children in the family, it's highly unlikely that each child would be able to have their own phone. Phones then need charging, and that means electricity is a cost. And then you need internet vouchers, and that's another cost. And when you've got all that, there's still no guarantee that you will have access to the internet. if you can solve all of those problems, then the next problem is what happens? How does the teaching learning process take place? And from what I can see from talking to lots of children and lots of parents, a standard procedure seems to have developed spontaneously, where teachers no longer teach. Teachers don't talk to the class for very long. What they do is give out multiple choice questions on a particular topic. The children take those questions away and answer them. And then at the end of the day, later in the day, they go back and send their answers to the teacher. And the teacher identifies, checks how many are correct and how many are incorrect. So the whole process is one of exchanging multiple choice questions and answers on the internet. And children are somehow supposed to find the answers by themselves. I mean, you could perhaps argue that it's developing independence in learning, but I don't think that's an adequate answer. So we have here two aspects of post-COVID life in Indonesia. And these two parts of the population are moving away from each other. One continues to be privileged. The other is having their education seriously disrupted and losing out in comparison with other parts of the population. Okay, next slide, please. And then, I mean, inequality within a nation, I just used Indonesia as an example. I'm quite sure that similar things are happening in many parts of the world. But we can also see evidence of growing inequality between nations. When COVID first appeared, I sometimes heard people saying very optimistically, oh, this is bringing us all together because we're all facing the same problem. Every country in the world is having to deal with COVID, and we will, as a world community, we will work together to solve it. It's not happening, and I think we know that it's not happening. One example is the question of vaccinations. Some countries have more doses than they need, and some countries have far, far fewer and are desperately trying to find doses. Greta Thunberg has referred to this as unethical, that young people in some parts of Europe are being vaccinated when many people in developing countries are not. Nurses, this is an interesting issue. Even before COVID, there was a world shortage of 6 million nurses, but what we find is that many of the nurses in the developed countries, even though they've been terribly overworked since COVID came, they come from developing countries, and the developing countries have an even more severe shortage of nurses. So the flows from poor to rich countries, it's predicted, will continue throughout COVID and post-COVID. So there's an irony and an injustice here. And we see the same thing with face masks, ventilators, and even oxygen, that the disparity, the inequality between nations is increasing. Next slide, please, Philip. And the same with the economy. I think you can look at those pictures yourself. It's women are more likely to lose their jobs than men. Low-skilled workers are more likely to lose their jobs compared to university-educated people, and young workers are more likely to lose their jobs than older people. And this occurs throughout the world, but to an even greater extent in developing countries. Okay. So my final points are these. If we think back to the current SDGs, and as Philip pointed out, there are 231 indicators, is that right? How meaningful are those indicators now? How meaningful are the sustainable development goals now, when education is going backwards, health is getting worse, and many of the other indicators we're losing progress in the other indicators. Towards the end of his presentation, Philip said that many of the chapters indicated that there is a story of progress to some extent. That was 4 years ago. I wonder if we went back to the same context now, would we still be able to see progress? I'm sure not. So what's the answer? Does it mean that the Sustainable Development Goals need to be recalibrated so that beginning where we are now and thinking about the target year of 2030, how much progress can we expect to make? Much more modest targets required. That would be a big job, a huge job. Or do we need something completely different? And I don't have any idea myself as to what those, what it might be. It's something that was different than simply a recalibrated version of the Sustainable Development Goals. If we did want to recalibrate, we would need to have a way of measuring where we are now and a way of measuring approximately where we want to go. Maybe some of the examples that Philip mentioned earlier of citizen-led assessment, for example, in Uganda would be helpful here. I've heard recently of an attempt in Bangladesh to a citizen-led attempt to measure what learners know now, 14, 15 months after COVID began. And then this leads on to an even wider question, and that is, how meaningful is it to have one set of international development goals when we already know that there is huge inequity, huge divergences between the less developed and the developed world, and those divergences are growing even wider. Is it meaningful to have one set of development goals? And then finally, I wonder, do the development goals have some value even if they haven't been met? I mean, it's conceivable, perhaps, that even if the targets are not reached, nevertheless, having them there is of some value. So my final question is, do they inhibit, do they encourage, or do they discourage development? Thank you for listening, and I'll be very interested to hear your responses to my questions. And I'd also like to say hello to several of the authors who are here. Very nice to see you. I think I can see 4 or 5 of the authors here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much for a really interesting and rich presentation, and even here for leaving us with some predetermined questions and points for discussion. But we have time for discussion, so we would encourage anyone in the audience. In the past, people have put questions in the chat, and I can read them out. Or if it's easier, you can also let us know you'd like to ask a question, and then, of course, just say it out loud. So yeah, perhaps while we're waiting for people to share any questions that they might have, I wonder if I could sort of turn one of these questions back to the two of you. Perhaps I'm looking at the 4th one here. How meaningful is it to have a set of uniform international goals? I wonder if you would like to share your thoughts on that while we wait for other people to share some of their questions.
Can I pass that to Philip?
Excuse me.
See what he thinks about that.
Yeah, my sense was, in a way, the whole of this exercise of the conference and the book has come about because of that exact thing happening. So there is this one uniform set of international SDGs, and the whole discussion has been about, okay, so what does it mean? How is it being measured, and how are people in reality responding to it? You know, how do you translate this kind of international ideal or principle to what's going on the ground in your life? And I think some of the things that I found the most interesting reading and working on these chapters with authors is exactly some of those the moments where sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's more difficult. And so I think it is helpful in a way. I think these discussions may not have happened in the same way if people aren't asking themselves, how do we aim towards X goal? But that's not to say that X goal is the right goal, or that it shouldn't be, you know, changed or abandoned sometimes, or certainly revised in the future. That's my feeling on the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, just well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure myself, but I wonder whether targets which are very specific are encouraging or potentially discouraging. They may be completely unrealistic, unachievable in certain contexts. And as we go through this experience of COVID, as I've tried to indicate above, they may be becoming even less feasible. In other contexts, the same targets may be an interesting challenge for a country. In other situations, they will already have been surpassed. So I just wonder, I don't have a very strong opinion about this.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think we have Frederica has a comment or a question. Frederica, would you like to just say it out loud?
Yes, easy. I'm typing so much. First of all, thank you, Philip and Hywel, for this really amazing summary of everything that happened and these wider questions. So my answer would be, I think it's really great that we moved from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, because they're universal. So it's no longer the global north trying to develop the global south. They include everybody, at least rhetorically. And I think that's important and something we need to insist on. And it's really interesting because Lilima has run a multilingual COVID information campaign, and I've been involved in discussions with diverse stakeholders in Finland who try to reach out to minoritized, linguistically minoritized people. The issues are exactly the same. So the same sustainable development goals can be applied in Finland and in Senegal. And I think that is really important. And that also gives me hope, because we now also need to look into the mirror in the global north and question our own policies that cause so many of the global issues that we're facing, the inequalities, climate change, harmful multilingual language policies that are based on standardized monolingualism as the norm, etc. And I think that is really important.
Yeah, really interesting.
Related to that point, I've been struck that obviously every country has an SDG agenda. For example, in the UK Parliament, there's groups looking at it and laws that get informed by it. And I think there's certainly a value there, certainly for a country like the UK, where huge swathes of the population just aren't aware of what multilingualism is, or development issues or anything like that. But it's interesting that obviously for example, in the UK, there are questions which are literally about the SDGs, about equality here, even about language. When you're talking about, the status of Welsh or British Sign Language, there's recently been, I think, British Sign Language has just been approved for the first time as a language that can be used in Parliament, I think. And these are all relevant. And I really see the point you were just making, Federico, it's not just about, you know, saying these things need to happen over there, but these things maybe need to happen here as well. And they might be different situations and questions, but the conversation is global, and that's quite powerful potentially.
I think you mentioned that a few of the other contributors are here as well. I wonder if anyone else has anything they'd like to say on that question, or questions they'd like to ask. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if there are particular.
Well, thank you very much, Hywel and Philip, for your very hard work getting this volume published. And indeed, things have changed a lot since then, but one thing that has moved forward and not backward is the digitization of society. And as Hywel pointed out, this brings about new fault lines, but we're still in the upward trend of digitization, and it was still at the beginning of the process. I think the ITU just published data for 2019, half the world's population is connected. If current trends uphold, by 2030, it'll be close to 80%. So that's billions of people coming online in the next decade. And that changes our relationship to the community as a whole. It brings about new challenges with regards to language, with regards to education, with regards to information. And I think it's a transversal view of the SDGs, but just as I'm worried that it doesn't figure enough in education research, it doesn't seem to figure very much in the SDGs. So definitely when the SDGs are reviewed by 2030, because the agenda we have at the moment, I believe, is 2030, then they should be adjusted. But perhaps that's just the nature of what the global framework is. It needs to be readjusted every now and then so that it keeps up with the times. But I think that volume will be very helpful as a testimony of where we were at in 2017 and just how we can move forward. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. We have a comment and one more question actually in the chat. Maybe I'll come to the question first. So I think in your presentation, you highlighted that the SDGs don't currently include a sort of specific mention of language, and interested in how you might rewrite them or how you think they could be written to either should that be made explicit or in multiple places should it be mentioned more explicitly. So Hywel and Philip, if you've got thoughts on that.
Well, I think there are all sorts of ways, all the way through in education, in accessing health care, health information, participating in democratic processes, in legal systems. Language has to be there everywhere, as Philip pointed out in his summary. Language is everywhere, but it's not being recognized in the SDGs. Philip.
I completely agree with that. I think exactly. I think it's just a case of I don't know of in the indicators identifying where language being ignored is a problem, and making it explicit. So we've seen examples just in this talk today, just simply something like, are you providing public health messages in languages that people will understand? Just some really basic questions. And it's not just about language as well, it's also about being sensitive to where people are coming from, as Hywel was pointed out, making certain assumptions about what people believe, the angle they're coming from. That's really important as well.
Yeah, it's like language is everywhere and then it's nowhere as a result.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was a comment about the SDG 4 particularly applying to early childhood development, but that being far from achieving it due to socioeconomic factors. So you have them where it really applies, but obviously there are confounding factors. I'm conscious of the time. We do want to sort of try and let our speakers go. So just want to say thank you all very much for joining us, but particularly to Hywel and Philip, of course, for their presentation, and obviously all of the work and the book, as well as the contributors who are here as well. So thank you all very much. We will have our next webinar in the Language and Sustainable Development webinar series, and I think Tracy's put the link in the chat to our website where the next webinar information is posted as well. So very nice to see some familiar faces, and also those of you who have joined us for the first time, do have a look at previous sessions as well. So information and recordings are up on the website, and consider joining us in the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who's joined. It's really good to see you.